Okay, we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mary Capone, and I am a program assistant here at UNA-NCA. I helped organize this panel discussion today, so I would like to give a little brief introduction. Globally, women endure disproportionate impacts of conflict, violence, displacement, and limited access to resources. Gender plays a crucial role in peace building, yet women remain underrepresented in the peacemaking processes. According to UN Women, women comprise less than 10% of negotiators, 14% of mediators, and 27% of peace process signatories in 2023. Research supports, however, that peace agreements involving women are more likely to succeed and be longer lasting. Reflecting the UN's missions to ensure gender equality, as well as peace, justice, and strong institutions, today's panel event will advocate for gender representation in domestic and international peace work from diverse perspectives, considering complex gender dynamics across cultures and religions. Panel speakers will discuss and answer some questions regarding women's roles in peace building and how international institutions like the UN can support such efforts. We will also be doing a Q&A following the discussion, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Kim Weichel. Kim is a thought leader, women's leadership champion, cross-cultural specialist, author, educator, and nonprofit leader who has worked on the forefront of building bridges between cultures and peoples for over 30 years. She's directed and led women's leadership organizations, international projects, peace-building initiatives, and cross-cultural educational programs. Kim has had a long background working with UN-related agencies and is on the UNA-NCA Advisory Council and the UNA Marin Board in California. Kim teaches with her husband in the lifelong learning program at American University and is working on her fourth book on key trends facing the nonprofit sector and how they can best respond. She currently resides in the San Francisco Bay Area. Kim, thank you so much for joining us. I'll have you introduce our panelists and we can get started.
Well, thank you, Mary, and welcome. So it's for me a delight to see friends and colleagues I haven't seen in 3 years since we left DC and moved back to our home here in California. So as Mary said, I've worked with women in many countries, and I know that women are the ones working at the grassroots level to build peace in their communities. They're the ones running NGOs, working for justice, working to heal divides. But as Mary said, women are significantly underrepresented in peace negotiations and at the peace table. But we know that the inclusion of women in peace process contributes to more sustainable peace. We also know that 50% of all peace treaties fail within 5 years when the key actors, women, are not involved. You can't heal a conflict. You can't have a peace treaty stand if you don't go to the roots of that conflict and have the key actors involved. So we know that women are critical in the peace building process. So today we have a remarkable panel of talented professional women in the field who will explore these issues, the role of women in peace building, the importance of gender representation, and how international institutions such as the United Nations can better support these efforts. So our first panelist is Liz Hume, who is the executive director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I'll say I love the Alliance. I've been a longtime supporter. They do great work. And Liz, I'm so glad you're at the helm. Liz is an international lawyer and a conflict expert with more than 25 years of experience in senior leadership positions in bilateral and multilateral institutions and NGOs. She has extensive experience in policy and advocacy and overseeing sizable and complex peacebuilding programs in conflict-affected and fragile states in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Liz is also an experienced mediator, and she is a frequent guest lecturer and author on conflict analysis and peace building in conflict-affected and fragile states. So Liz, welcome. I thought we should start with a context setter, an overview for the audience. So given your long career in peace building, could you give an overview on the current state of international peace building and where we are with the women, peace, and security agenda now?
First, I have to get off mute. Well, I want to say hi, Kim. And there's been no bigger supporter of women's issues than you, Kim. And so I can't thank you for your decades of work and your continued work on these issues. So thank you. So where are we right now? It's tough. I'm not, we need to be very clear. It is tough, both here in the US and globally. And I just want to start by saying, the UN Secretary General said there is a surge in misogyny and a furious kickback against equality, and it threatens to slam the brakes and push progress into reverse. And this is unacceptable, it's immoral, and it's self-defeating. We must stop it, and we must stop it together. And that, I think, is the key term, stop it together. Especially as we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of 1325. What I want to say, though, is this work is not linear. And we cannot become cynical. We cannot, give up. When we were preparing for this call, I was talking about my grandmother, my amazing grandmother, the most important person in the world to me, was born in 1902 without the right to vote in the US. We owe it to those women, we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the women that come after us to not be cynical and to keep working together. Right here in the United States, we have the WPS Act. Again, pushback on it in terms of, we all saw what Pete Hegseth did when he talked about it stopping this program. It's not a program, it's a law. And we need to be collectively working together to make sure that WPS here in the United States continues its implementation, but also in the UN. Right now, the UN is so critical. We have an incredible Secretary General right now that is pushing this work forward. And we need to make sure that the gains are maintained and that we continue on. And that is the funding, the resources. If you don't have it, you can't do it. It's, even if it's the statutory minimums, that's what we're starting to talk about now. But even if it's those statutory minimums, we need to make sure that those are met, that we are, requiring that these statutory minimums continue, and that we don't get cynical, and that we not just talk about what's wrong, what's getting broken, but where we're seeing gains and where we're seeing wins and keeping those moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say, I think that's so important to be hopeful and to be positive and not to be deterred from doing the work that we need to do, because there's been backsliding, there's a lot of challenges, but that's the opportunity for those of us involved to step forward and really speak out. And I think being honest and open is really key. So thank you, Liz. I appreciate that overview. Next, I'm going to introduce Mariam Jalabi. Mariam is a co-founder of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. She has also served as the representative of the Syrian Opposition Coalition to the United Nations in New York for over 13 years. She has led diplomatic engagement with the permanent missions of the United Nations and UN agencies on inclusive peace and security. Her work focuses on women's inclusion in politics and decision-making. Mariam's advocacy and leadership have proven instrumental in framing the narrative on Syria with the international community. So, Mariam, I really want to start with Syria because there's been just so much devastation we've watched on the news and just tremendous pain and confusion. But now there seems to be a new opening, and want to be hopeful here. So given your long background there, I'd love you to give us an update on the Syrian situation, what the women's political movement is doing, how much leverage do you have?
Thank you. Thank you for this, Kim. Syria has been under dictatorship for over 54 years. So thinking about how this trajectory has created a country that does not have much of a political culture or the right institutions to carry equality and human rights. And it was basically a mafia ruling the country. So the resistance to this regime has actually started from my dad's generation. And that's how I ended up being in New York. It's because my dad had to flee the country after after being imprisoned 5 times and severely tortured. So long story short, the Syrian revolution started in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring, and people came out to the street, demonstrating and wanting freedom. And at the beginning, it wasn't even toppling down of the regime, but rather was wanting rights and human rights and becoming part of the international community. And that was faced with severe, like the regime replied to that with severe violence, with killing. Over like 500,000 people were killed, and that's when the UN stopped recording the killing. Half of the population, about 15 million people, fled the country. There were 6 million displaced internally. The destruction has reached like 75% of the country. And in all of this, women, and while the men fighting with their weapons, running around with weapons, when all of these different governments and countries came in, to support this group and that group, and it became like a war, full-fledged war. Women were on the streets. Women were the ones who were keeping, the social fabric of society, doing all of the work on the ground. And we, as women who are connected to the women on the ground, whether inside or in the diaspora or the refugee communities, we've realized there weren't women included in all of the decision-making spaces. They're the ones who are working on the ground. They are the ones who know what the needs are, and they're not the ones who are sitting, deciding what the future is. So in 2017, we started something called the Syrian Women's Political Movement, deciding we're not only serving, we're not only giving, medicine and education and taking care of the people on the ground. We are actually interested in making this a country that the decisions are made at the highest level with the participation of women. So if I may, I put myself 4 minutes, Kim. So I'm gonna show you a couple of pictures, which I think brings like a feeling of what this is as women. So I'm gonna share with you a little bit of our okay. I don't know how to make this a full screen. I made it earlier. Okay, here, slideshow. If you could see this, this is the establishment of the Syrian Women's Political Movement in 2017. That was 8 years ago when we decided we women needed to come together and establish something that will call for the participation of women in all of the political processes, in the all peace processes. Like Mary mentioned at the beginning, without women being at the table, we cannot guarantee peace and democracy. And then with the fall of the regime on December 8th, and it happened, I mean, I can go into details if you want a little bit later, if people are more curious to know later on how that happened. But on December 8th, the regime fell, like in the movies, got on a plane, flew over to Russia and saved himself and the family. And everything crumbled, and it went back to the hands of the Syrian people and the Syrian armed groups that are on the ground. And they tried to keep the peace. There have been clashes, there have been killings in different parts, but mostly it has been peaceful. And I want to show the picture of Elise Mafrej. This is a woman who has been at the forefront and the only woman who was assigned as a deputy negotiator on the Syrian case in 2014, but it was not enough for her. So she was part of the co-founders with me and a few other women of the Syrian Women Political Movement. And then this is her, and she was not allowed to go back to the see, my 4 minutes are over, but give me 30 more seconds. Then Elise was in Damascus after having been in exile for 14 years to actually give a talk in the middle of Damascus about the liberation, about how women need to be included on decision-making processes. In this conference that we did to establish ourselves down in Damascus on January 8th, after a month of the fall of the regime, we invited about 200 to 150 people, and it was an open conference, but over 350 people showed up to this. A lot of press was there. And this is what made us realize that the importance of how us putting our foot down and saying, here we are, it actually does get a reaction from people. People come in and want to be part of it. And part of that was, I want to show you this picture on the left, where you see Thuraya Al-Hadi with a baby that's 2 weeks old. Thuraya Al-Hadi brought her sister to help her, the sister with her in the picture, to come. She came from Raqqa, from all the way in the furthest north of Syria to Damascus. The trip took her 2 days. She had a cesarean section 2 weeks earlier. She's like, I cannot miss the moment when the Syrian women political movement come together. And we were the first political entity in 1 month only after the fall of the regime to do this big conference. She's like, I cannot miss this moment. And she comes with her baby and was with us at this conference. This shows you the resilience of the people and how these women are able to rebuild this country. We can go into more detail. I'm going to stop here. And with a picture of Salam, the little girl is called Salam, which means peace in Arabic.
Oh, well, thank you so much. The whole Syrian situation has been so moving. And I just want to say, we really appreciate the courage of the Syrian women, and what you're doing is just extraordinary. So I have more questions for you, but we'll come back to that in our panel discussion. I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Katherine Marshall. As a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and professor of the practice of development, religion, and conflict in the School of Foreign Service, Katherine is the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, whose mission is to bridge gulfs separating the worlds of development and religion. Katherine, you wear many hats, that's for sure. Her long career with the World Bank as an operational manager, focused especially on Africa, but she also served on numerous task forces and in other leadership positions. She and Susan Hayward from U.S. Institute of Peace led a 2-year project culminating in a book that focused on women from religious communities engaged in peace building. She works today to build links among different institutions, sectors, and approaches, with a focus on the imperatives of global peace and development to bring both hope and realism to the multilateral challenges involved. So welcome, Katherine. You have dedicated, of course, much of your career to linking the spheres of religion and global development. So can you talk about how the context and narratives about women's roles in peace building have changed over the decades? Where do you think we are now?
Well, the first comment I would make is that I started a long time ago, at a time when the issues for women overall, particularly in the development field, but even in, law schools, medical schools, etc., was almost unthinkable. And of course, we've seen a transformation with much progress. So in that sense, I'm sort of in the Madeleine Albright school of being a cockeyed optimist, but also one who worries a lot, particularly with the current situation, which really is devastating. I think when you look back over our long careers and just see the questioning of things that we've taken for granted are good, of empathy and compassion and caring about peace, it seems as if those are out the window. But I also want to highlight, sort of following up on the particular niche in which I have found myself most recently, with Liz's comment about needing to do this together and the need for solidarity. And one of the interesting bridges we've had to build is between women who come from religious communities and more secular women's organizations, where there has historically, and for not without reason, let's put it this way, been a certain amount of tension. And we focused a lot on the remarkable work of, for example, Catholic nuns and women in Indonesia, women in the Middle East, all parts of the world, who really come with a religious inspiration. In a sense, they're often fighting within their own hierarchies to have a voice and to be able to move forward. So I think that what this illustrates more than anything is the need to build the bridges among different communities, because this work for peace is not just being at a table and negotiating exactly what the terms of disarmament will be. It is much more the kind of society we want to build, the cohesion within the society, including the ability to deal with difference, which is certainly something that's very high on our agendas right now. So I'll stop with that one for now.
Thanks, Catherine. And a follow-up question. What are some of the assets and liabilities that women coming from religious communities face in working for peace, and how do religious and cultural values influence peace building?
Well, many, obviously, for example, Catholic sisters are driven by a sense of charism, a sense of mission. But there's an interesting asset they have, which came out in Susie's and my work on our book, which was the idea of invisibility. It goes back, of course, in poetry and literature, what happens when the king disguises himself and learns something. But many of these women are even more invisible than the secular women, that they're simply not seen, and they may not be part of bureaucracies and hierarchies. And one of the results is that often they can do things, unexpected things that are really outside the bounds of institutions and expectations. The point that we had to make was that this was really not the purpose. In other words, you don't want to build on invisibility, you want to make them visible. But it is an interesting twist. And of course, some women prefer the invisibility, and whether it's modesty, but that also comes with a lot of disadvantages of lack of recognition and lack of resources. So this question of celebrating and telling the stories of what women are doing, as Mariam is doing right here, is an important piece of trying to move forward.
Mm. Yeah, telling stories is really so key, so we can really understand from people's own experience. So I'd like to turn now to some questions for the panel. I'd like all three of you to address some of these questions. And the first, of course, is the role of the United Nations. How can international organizations like the UN better incorporate diverse voices into peace building? What actions can the UN and other institutions take to go from the goal of women's engagement to more practical, tangible results? And what are the key issues to advocate for? So I realize it's a lot of questions. Take any one of them or several of them. Liz, why don't we start with you?
Sure, I can start. I'm usually the wonky person down in the weeds of how to get this stuff done. The United Nations is so critical right now, given its role on these issues. We have this big anniversary coming up in October. We need to make sure that we have evidence, we have stories, because that's what people remember, but the evidence to back it up. Now, I mean, these are just some key things that I'm looking at. I mean, we know we've all seen these leaked memos, right? The UN is going to go under a significant reorganization, or they're trying to. The cuts to the UN funding, not just with the US, but the Chinese and others are not paying their bills. We need to make sure that any reorganization in the United Nations, this work is prioritized, it's integrated, it's centered. This cannot go away, right? So that's the first thing we need to be really pushing for, to remember that. We have a great advocate in the Secretary General. No one has been better in, that's why I started off with a quote by him. But we also need to remember that, starting really with COVID, that's where we've seen a lot of backsliding with women issues and women's gains. I think Melinda Gates said a couple of years ago, it would take 100 years for women to hit parity on economic issues. So we need to make sure that our voices are so loud, especially moving into this fall, about this work this is where it's going to have to really be pushed in the UN. But it also means we have to go back to our capitals. We can't let the US walk back on these issues. We know we have champions, bipartisan champions in Congress that have been pushing these issues through. So we need to make sure we hold them accountable. The Germans, we know, are at the forefront on these issues. We have to go to also all our capitals and tell them this has to be pushed forward, both at the bilateral level, but they need to keep their voices heard at the UN. And looking at this reorganization and these cuts, this cannot be where this work is cut. So I think that's really our big focus for this year.
And informing the audience or the US audience is really one of the roles of the UN associations. I have to add, of course, UNA-NCA that I've been so much a part of. I'm on the board now of the Marin, where the UN originally was going to be housed, by the way. I've seen plans drawn up for it to be housed in Marin County. And then the Rockefellers offered the land in New York, and they decided to set up in New York, which I'm glad they did. But anyway, let's turn to Mariam or Katherine to answer the questions about the UN. Who wants to go first? Mariam, you go ahead.
Maybe I'll go just to go after Liz from pointing out the huge importance that the UN can play as an international institution in working on conflict in all of these different areas and raising women, the need for marginalized groups, not just women, by the way. It has to be, because the people who usually are leading in conflict on making things worse are the ones who have the weapons. It's the abled men who are making these decisions for the rest of the population. Usually they're not more than 10-20% of the population. All of the elderly, all of the young, all of the people who don't want to be involved, all of the students, a lot of people are not involved in these conflicts. So there is an important factor that I've been working with the UN a lot on this and trying to localize a lot of the work that the UN is doing. Because sometimes what's happening, and from our experience in Syria, when you have like a blanket way of dealing with all of the different issues, all of the different conflicts, what happens is that it doesn't take into the sensitivity and into account some of the issues that are particular to that place. And now we see some of the backlash actually at the UN, that the special envoy, when they first time entered into Syria, even the new like armed groups that had taken over in Damascus, sat with them for half an hour and let them out. They didn't even talk with them. They didn't want to even talk with them. And then the second meeting, there was this woman who was hitting them with her shoe, right? Walking away from the meeting that they tried to have with the, the new assigned president of Syria. So the history is very full with a lot of the rejection, but the UN as an institution has the skills, has the people, has the technicalities, has the overall arching programs the mechanisms that can actually be incredibly beneficial to working on the ground. And this is where I think it's very important, this is crucial for the UN to be localizing and working with people on the ground, and specifically women, to make a real difference. And this is my whole work that I'm doing with the UN, is that how to work with more women on the ground, DDR, SSR, any kind of mechanisms that dealing with the detainees, the disappeared, the reconstruction, all of this stuff that the UN can do really well needs to have the local community involved in that decision and the design that they want to see this put forward.
Absolutely. So great. Katherine, please.
Well, I have lots of thoughts, but let me focus on two. The first is this term peace building is important, because the idea is that peace is broad and it's continuing. It's not peacemaking. It's not conflict resolution. It's not peacekeeping. It's peace building. And that means that the entire UN system needs to be involved in these issues. The health issues, the UNICEF, the children, right across the board, down to the most technical. So I think that's a first point, is understanding. And it's interesting, in interviews we've done with women working on peace, that's something they emphasize very much, is that peace is not just the peace table. It's a much, much broader issue, and it means giving hope. It means development. Development is the new name for peace. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to use a phrase that a wonderful woman from India used in a meeting recently, which is that some young person came back from a meeting and she asked, how was it? And he said, NATO. She said, well, what does that mean? And she said, no, he said, no action, talk only. So I think that the basic thing that we have to focus on is moving to the implementation. And of course, the UN is renowned for talk, for its wordsmithing in declarations with the tiny, the removal of a comma. But we really need to move towards what is it actually going to take to remove the obstacle, or to open the opportunity, or to hear the voice of the most marginalized. So I think that this notion of really keeping a focus constantly on the implementation is especially critical.
Absolutely, I agree. And I just want to raise up for a moment the work of the Alliance for Peacebuilding that was instrumental in bringing the word peace building, Katherine, as you rightly say, onto Capitol Hill, for people to understand its complexities, what it is, how it differs from peacemaking, peace. And so, you know, I really acknowledge their long work to also focus on conflict prevention and not just waiting till the conflict has erupted. So I want to turn now to a difficult but very important topic, which is the connection between conflict and violence against women. We know that violence against women, I would say, is the worst human rights violations of our time, whether it be human trafficking, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, rape is a weapon of war, sexual conflict, etc. So, I mean, there's some 50 million victims of violence at any time, many of whom are from conflict areas. So could you talk about this? What are you aware of that's being done to reduce violence and to hold perpetrators accountable? So who would like to start with that one? Liz, I'm going to call on you.
So how to keep people, how to make people responsible, hold people
Yes, and
accountable?
what work, and especially what the, let's say, IFP is doing, how is this, you know, unfolding?
Okay, so this is a really great question. You know, we know women are, you know, more likely to be impacted by conflict. One of the things we did in Ukraine, day one of that conflict, we were on the phone that weekend with USAID and other funders to say, you need to be funding tracking violations, tracking atrocities, especially against women on day one, right? We saw what happened in the Balkans and Bosnia and Kosovo and how long it took to, if ever, hold, you know, a lot of atrocities against women accountable. So the US at the time, that week, started funding in real time ways to help Ukrainian government track atrocities in real time. We know that that funding's gotten cut now, but the work that they were doing in real time was so critical. So that is, you know, and that's one of the things we in the whatever peace process, whatever is happening in Ukraine, we need to get this right this time. It can't be never again, but then, okay, it's happening again. And these are the issues we'll sweep under the rug because we want a peace process. You know, it's going to keep happening until we are able to actually, you know, track what's happening in real time, hold people accountable during and after. And so this is one of, I think, really important work. And it's not just in wartime. We see what's happening in Mexico with femicide. We've had two high-profile women killed. So it's not just, you know, the getting women involved in the peace processes and the work, that's critical. But if women are on the front lines and being attacked just for being women, you know, this, you know, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And I'm really, this is one thing I know you all know Megan Corrado, who's incredible on these issues, on the Ukraine issues and what women, and I know, you know, men have also been impacted, but the atrocities that women have experienced, this is where we need to say never again. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mariam or Katherine? Mariam, go please.
So I want to point, thank you, Liz, for that, to the fact that also what intensifies this experience and makes violence against women even more of an issue for the country in general is that women do not it prevents them from having access to the market, to work, It affects their well-being. It affects their existence. It affects their connection to the families. It affects where they get placed in society, because there's so many women who were sexually violated inside prisons in Syria. When they come out, the way the society deals with them is in a very stigmatized way. And this is one layer that needs to be really addressed, like now coming out of the conflict right now. And there's so many different women organizations and human rights organizations that are looking at this. But also another layer that is most time forgotten in connection to the violence against women is that when a woman does not have food to put on her table, when the country is so devastated that people live under 95% lives under the poverty line, and most of those are women. A lot of women have lost the men in the family and the breadwinners, and they're trying to make ends meet. That's violence against women. That's when it puts them in places where they actually can be taken advantage of more, and a weaker space. Like, so not having shelter, not having a place to keep her children, not having a way to teach her, like to take them to healthcare, not having a way of taking them to education. All of that compiles the situation, aside from the specific violations that happen to women physically. Then this is a whole other layer that makes her life even so much more complicated, that I believe that international community and the human rights organizations and women organizations need to be paying attention to, in order to prevent not just dealing with women who have gone through the violence, but the situation and the circumstances that lead to even more of that violation in circumstances, especially right after conflict, or in spaces where, I don't know, peace building spaces like Syria right now.
Thank you. Katherine.
Well, I have many thoughts, but I have three. Let's see if I can remember them. First, I think, is the question of trafficking that you mentioned, which of course goes way beyond the questions of peace and conflict. But it is interesting how much the rise or the increases or particular vulnerability to trafficking is linked to conflicts and refugee movements and forced migration, because that, in a sense, is when people may be most vulnerable. And so there is a lot of trafficking that is taking place. And there are a lot of different networks and groups globally that are working, that include some of these Catholic sisters through an organization called Talitha Cum. And that they really work very much at the grassroots. And of course, the answer that everyone always gives to trafficking is that it's linked to poverty. That when people are desperate and don't have other choices, they may fall into this, and ignorance, I guess, the lack of knowledge. So that's the first, I think, is the importance of trafficking, which is not only women. But interestingly, in the trafficking, in the modern slavery statistics now, a very substantial part is child marriage and forced marriage. So that's a big part of the problem, and they're all interlinked. The second issue I'd mention just briefly is what is called sextortion, which is linking some of the vulnerability of women to the corruption issues as a form of corruption, that women have no choice, that they find themselves in a situation of just blatant bribery or blatant being forced into situations because of their vulnerability. The third point is on this question of domestic violence. I was talking this morning to a Catholic sister in Kenya, doing an interview with her and talking about domestic violence. And the point that she made is that it's what you have to deal with is women's dependence, which is a sad commentary, that being dependent on someone opens you to violence. But that is the fact. And so their solution is that the women have to have some possibility of owning land and possibility of earning some kind of income, which then gives them at least the possibility of escaping from a situation and being able to address it. So that's one of, I think, the many, many ways that groups all over the world are trying to deal with it. The interesting thing about domestic violence, or the saddest statistic, I don't know if it's still true, but I remember it from the early days, was that 50% of women who've experienced domestic violence have never spoken about it to a living soul. So it's a very lonely, lonely topic, and one where very often people think it happens somewhere else, to other cultures, other societies, not to ours. But in fact, it's everywhere and all too pervasive.
No, it certainly is. Thank you, Catherine. I just would like to add briefly here that I've been involved for some years with something called the Every Woman Global Campaign to End Violence Against Women. It's really been pushing with activists and leaders in different parts of the world for a new treaty, because we know CEDAW focuses mostly on discrimination, not specifically on violence. Then you have regional treaties, but this would call for something that specifically focuses on the many aspects of violence. Now it's being focused on as an optional protocol to CEDAW, which sounds technical, but we're getting the support of different nations to have this. Just like with the global pandemic, you really need to focus on it. This is a multifaceted issue. Just briefly, it has 5 points: to strengthen laws, to promote greater education in the schools, to train nurses, doctors, judges, policemen, and what to look for when someone is trafficked, because it's often hard to tell, to provide more shelters and hotlines to support women in need, and to increase funding. So those are, if you're interested, you can look up Every Woman Global Campaign. It's very important, and I'm been, actively involved with it. I have one more question for the panel. I know we want to turn to audience questions, so maybe keep your responses rather brief. And if you haven't written your question in the chat, please do so now. So, and that is bringing us up to what's happening. We're all concerned about the cutbacks in U.S. government funding, particularly foreign aid and U.S. Institute of Peace, et cetera. So I'm wondering to each of you, how is this affecting your work and the people you work with overseas? And how can we move this agenda forward during these extraordinary times? So who wants to start with that?
I can just start off and say it's really been devastating. The programs, the conflict expertise loss, so many people have lost their jobs. We know that we're already starting to see reports. The Institute for Economics Peace, countries are getting hit by, the tariff issues, the loss of aid, et cetera, at a time of increasing violent conflict. So this is just for the peace building conflict prevention field as a whole. It is grim, but we also know we needed reforms. So let's take this opportunity. We are still working with Congress. I mean, in some respects, it's a little weird because we are talking to them about, maintaining accounts that they have, funding status quo, even though we know that funding won't get out this year. But we're also looking forward, right? Take this opportunity as a reform measure. We've been arguing for integration of peace building and conflict prevention for more than 2 decades, since I've been around, right? Going back into the 90s. We've never really had that happen. We have some examples and we eat around the edges. This is our opportunity now to make sure that conflict prevention and peace building is fully integrated throughout development and humanitarian sectors, for example. So there are things that we can be doing now and later, but again, we have to be working collectively together. And, Megan Corrado has worked very closely with USIP on the Civil Society Working Group. We are continuing that. USIP just got this great decision. We'll keep working closely with them on that. But now's the time, if you're not involved, to get involved with the Alliance for Peace Building. And yeah, it's my biggest plea right now.
I support that plea. Thank you, Liz. Miriam, and then Catherine.
I think just also thank you always for going with Liz. It gives me like she says a lot of the stuff that I have been thinking about and answers to it. But I think having sat with a lot of other feminists in this field and working with the UN, with the international community, it affected all of us. It affected all of the organizations that I'm working with. This whole, change in the US policy on foreign aid and USAIP and USAID and all of that. I think, I don't know, and I don't have specific answers to it, but maybe this is a wake-up call for us feminists, to start to rethink is about what are we doing wrong? Why do we have this huge backlash when in reality this is about the benefit of all, right? This is about taking care of the children, It's about calling for mothers' help. It's about really supporting families, for women to have more, I don't know, access to resources, more access to spaces. Why is this huge backlash? Are we not messaging right? Are we like, I think for me, I mean, I don't know, I don't have the answers. Even like in funding now like to fund, like, because I work also in trying to find funding and access to resources for Syrian women, for women in the region, and it's become very difficult. It's like, how do we make this connection between needing to support women in the Middle East when also women need support here, right, in the US? How do we create that connection? And this is when maybe Liz talked about, is that solidarity or that connection, that work together that we need to do. Anyways, these are a lot of questions that I still don't have answers to, and I don't feel like there's a lot of us who have like concrete answers to, but I think it's a really good wake-up call for us to sit and re-strategize and rethink about what are we doing that is not working, to include everybody and to work in a better space. And also like that whole idea about not going linear, that sometimes we do regress in order to make a better, move forward. So these are some of my thoughts about where can we go these days or now with the situation.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. Katherine.
Well, I echo the word grim, and clearly hearing what's happening in countries, poor communities where the funds have been cut off abruptly and with so much uncertainty and so many people losing jobs and losing their ideals or having their ideals so profoundly challenged, I think is really devastating. Teaching students working on international development and conflict resolution, sort of seeing them sort of having the rug just completely pulled out from them is devastating. We're also deeply concerned as the websites are closed off with preserving the information and the knowledge, because that's a big issue. And watching this absolutely stunning scrubbing of vocabulary, having anything, I've seen some that say women, gender, everything. I mean, it's a huge list of words that are being scrubbed, which really comes back to, in a sense, where I started, which is that there are certain values that we think we hold. And I think I still believe we hold them. I still believe that there is compassion and empathy, and that is deeply ingrained in most people. And the questioning of that in the policy realm is really perhaps what is most disturbing at a gut level, as well as just this desperate sense of how can we help and how can we, yes, rethink, yes, move forward, rescue what there is, but more than that, really return to the core values that have led us to want to work for peace in the first place.
Thank you, Katherine. So now we're turning Mary to you to ask questions from the audience.
All right. Feel free to leave some questions in the Q&A box. I'm not seeing any at the moment, but we can give that a minute. And in the meantime, if there's any more questions, Kim, that you have, feel free to give a little bit more time to those.
But I do hope we get some from the audience. So feel free to write your questions in. So I was going to ask Miriam, but I'll ask all of you about her work in nonviolence, and in the importance of engaging gender voices in the whole sector of nonviolence. Could you speak a little bit about that, Miriam, and anyone else?
So this is very, very important question for me because I believe what separates us feminists and people who are involved in human rights and want a better world for all, a better future for humanity, is the ones who do not believe that violence is the way to solve problems. And it just seems that a lot of the issues that are creating devastation in the world, and specifically for women, now we see all of the war, that's happening in Palestine, on Gaza, the war that has been happening for the last 14 years in Syria. It's about these men who have a lot of military power, a lot of access to resources, whether they themselves have it or they are supported by other men, by the privileged, patriarchy, in order to take power over and to make decisions for the rest of the population. This was the beginning, at the beginning of the revolution in the Syrian woman, in the Syrian case, is that we came out very strongly saying, no matter what happens, yes, this is a dictatorship that has been ruling the country at that time for 40 years, and we want to topple it down, but by non-violence means. And that's the time when we started with the non-violence movement in Syria, that we are not going to use any weapons, and the resistance is going to be, Gandhi style resistance through non-violence means. It doesn't mean you sit back pacifist and you don't act. That's not the intention. The intention is that how do you resist in ways that makes them weak, like you pull their pillars from underneath them, because they cannot be in that space unless they have this power, military power. So if you no longer count on the military power, it's the people power, that's when you lose, the game. So from what happened, it's very interesting, is that in Syria, there were a lot of people who were distributing weapons on the ground with the knowledge of the government, because the government knew how to fight back people who are carrying weapons. And because they didn't know what to do with the domestic, demonstrations that were completely not violent. So when slowly the resistance to and they used extreme violence to get people to use, defense, in self-defense. At the beginning, it was defending, neighborhoods, it was defending, cities, and then it became a full-fledged war. So they brought in all of these other countries, and everybody started bringing in weapons, which created this whole devastation. I believe personally, and a lot of the people we work with, we need to stop solving issues with violence. And women are the ones who can come, not because we can't do violence, we can do a lot of violence. And there are a lot of brigades, women brigades, that have been fighting in Syria also. But I think what we can bring as a new way of thinking and working forward is to stop solving problems with violence, starting, at the lowest level to the highest level.
I think nonviolence is so misunderstood. A lot of people see it as weak, as you've pointed out, but it takes tremendous inner strength. Mary, I see there are a couple of questions, but Liz or Catherine, did you want to add a comment or two about this?
I just would add one thing that comes out of my experience, and I think it's also reflected in surveys, that women as an aggregate tend to have different agendas in meetings. And it's one of the things that women bring that's different. And clearly the violence is a piece of it. But when you have a meeting, you will not hear about issues for women and children unless there are women in the room. They care about that. They care about water supply. They care about the things that seem, to me at least, the most important and the most logical. So I think that that's perhaps a broader part of, maybe it's socialization, maybe it's, I don't know, family structure, but it certainly is something I see, the difference in agendas.
Oh, 100%. I mean, you look at, there was an incredible documentary about the peace process in Northern Ireland, and you just see it in any peace process, right? You have, you know, it's the power structure, who gets what, who wins, and you're talking about, the very operations and the power struggles. Women get involved and it becomes on what drove the conflict. What are the actual issues that need to be resolved, right? Because we all know once you've been involved in a conflict, a country, within 10 years, you're more likely to go back because why? It was just a power agreement. And you see that, and even though this research is out there, and this is why, women, peace, and security, and our voices are so important, because it is always shocking to see we have this research, we know what works, we know what has to be, and then you have what happened with the Taliban, right? Or the agreement in Sudan, right? The ceasefire. Um, and so, you know, I'm always amazed that we continue to do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results or thinking that this is just different. And this is why it is so important in our field to have standards, actually. The humanitarians have what is the book called? The Sphere Standards, right? This is what you need. We don't have that. And that's what we're pushing for with Principles for Peace, for example, so that we can be able to push back and say, no, you can't do this. And this is what you have to do. So that's really where our field also needs to go in the next decade.
Thanks, Liz. Mary, do you want to ask those final two questions? Can we go over a little bit?
I think for now we might, I'm sorry, go ahead and skip the Q&A and go to the closing remarks. But I can compile all these questions into a document, and we can, if we have time, we can discuss. But I know it's the end of the hour, so Ryan, if you wanted to sort of say your piece for the closing remarks, you can feel free to go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Brenner, and I am the co-chair of the UNA-NCA Peace and Security Committee. I want to thank our panelists and our moderator, Kimberly, so much for really a detailed and in-depth discussion. And I know we could go on, and some of the questions in the chat were quite interesting. So I would be interested for us to follow up on that somehow. I also want to thank Andrew and Mary for organizing this, and invite everyone to future events of UNA-NCA and the Peace and Security Committee that we will plan to hold. I also want to leave us with sort of an optimistic message here, and that would be that for all of us to choosing to be peace builders, and to be working in peace building, paid or unpaid, part-time or full-time, in whatever capacity we are, is in itself a radical act in the world we live in today, which is filled with so much conflict and division. And I want to encourage us to push through during these hard times, and as Kim said, step forward. I really like that idea. And this discussion discussed how the path of peace building and progress is not linear. And I also believe that we're going to be making the road by walking it. And that means taking things one day at a time, showing up when we can, and imagining and innovating new ways to be involved, to push forward for justice, inclusion, and peace building. I really want to encourage everyone to keep thinking, writing, and advocating for resources for women's rights groups, for women, peace, and security, and gender equality at the UN and more broadly. And we'd love to have your participation in the future at other events. So, with that being said, thank you so much for attending, and I wish you all a very restful, hopefully, Memorial Day weekend.
And I want to add my thanks to UNA-NCA for organizing this, but to our panelists, not just for speaking today, but for the work you've done for decades to build peace, whether it's Syria, whether it's the international. I just am so in honor and so supportive of what each of you are doing. So thank you for that. May we each continue this important work. So thank you all for attending as well.
Thank you all.